For the past 2 Sundays, we've been walking through the Old Testament story of Job, a guy whom God calls blameless and upright, whom God says, he's my best guy. I have nobody like him in the whole world. And God blesses him with children and family and respect in his community and riches. And because Job and God are such good friends, this really makes the enemy, Satan, mad. Now, Satan is the Hebrew word for enemy, so it's no wonder that he acts that way. And the enemy challenges God and says, Job's good only because you're good to him. You made him rich. Take away everything he has and he'll curse you to your face. And God says, you think so? I don't. Have at him. Take all of his stuff. You just watch. And the enemy arranges for thieves and fire to take away all he has and for death to take his children. And Job responds, naked I came into this life, and naked I shall return and leave it. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job thinks God did that to him, and yet he holds on to his faith, hope, and love. Well, this makes the enemy even madder. And he goes back to challenge God, and God laughs at him and says, how about my friend Job? He's still my best guy, even though you incited me against him without cause. And Satan snorts back at him and says, skin for skin. A man will give anything that he has for his life. You reach out your hand against him himself, and he'll curse you to your face. And God says, you think so? I don't. Have at him. Do what you want, but you can't kill him. And the enemy strikes him with painful, open, running sores all over his body. And Job sits in the dirt and scrapes himself with a piece of broken pottery. And his wife says, look at you. Why don't you just curse God and die? And Job says, darling, that's just crazy talk. God has been so good to us so long. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And in all of this, Job, even though he thinks God did it, he still holds on to his faith, hope, and love. Now, so far, Job looks pretty heroic, doesn't he? And the enemy, he acts like our enemy, which is not surprising. Jesus said he comes to rob, to kill, and to destroy, and that's exactly what he did to Job. But there's another character in this story that is troublesome. That would be God. God, who allegedly loves Job, who's so very proud of Job, who blessed Job abundantly up till this point in his life, God who didn't actually do any of the yuck that happened, the enemy did that, but God allowed it. He gives the enemy permission to ransack Job's life, to steal his stuff and kill his kids and ruin his health. Now, Satan didn't do his worst. He didn't kill Job, not because he didn't want to, but because God wouldn't let him. It's good to know that the enemy is on a leash that God holds on to, and the enemy is not able to do anything to us beyond that which God gives him permission to do. Yet, at the same time, it's still puzzling and disturbing that God allows the enemy to do anything to anybody. Why would God do that? Why would God let Satan beat up his friend? And since Job's not the only one who's had his life torn apart, why does God allow tragedy to happen anywhere in the world? And closer to home, why does he let it happen to us? His children, whom he says he loves, and to whom he makes all those promises about taking care of us, like what we heard today in Psalm 91. If God loves us, and he's as big and strong as the Bible says he is, why does he let the devil disperse so much disease and disability and divorce and death? Unfortunately, like Job in this story, most of the time, we don't know. We don't know. If you read the whole story of Job, and I urge you to do that, you'll notice that Job never gets the glimpse of God in heaven that we, the reader, do. Job doesn't know what's going on in the throne room of heaven. Job doesn't know how proud God is of him and how angry that makes the enemy. Job doesn't know that God protects him from the worst that the enemy can dish out. But he also doesn't know that God gave the devil permission to do what he did. until Job arrives in heaven and God pops the video of his life up on the screen. See, that's why we added this to the service, so that this place would be a little bit more like heaven. And until Job gets to heaven and sees the video and sees how his life fits into the big picture of all of creation and all of history, Job is aware of only a very few pixels in that picture. Until then, Job has no idea of what really happened, that it was the enemy that did it to him, or why. Because God allowed it. And most of the time, most of us won't know either. We're simply not privy to all that happens in heaven, to the angels that help us, to the confidence that God has in us, to the accusations our enemy lodges against us, about the prayers of the saints for us, or the decisions of God about us and what he allows the enemy to do or not do to us. Job didn't know any of that. And most of the time, we won't either. But to Job's credit, in his ignorance of the big picture and his misconception that it was God who did all that stuff to him, in his pain and his suffering, Job hangs on to his faith, hope, and love. When that happens to us, will we? We may never know all the details of God's decisions about our lives until we arrive in heaven and God shows us. But in the meantime, the Bible, and especially the story of Job, give us some hints about why God allows life to be so difficult. Now, much of it is human error. Sin is an infection, and it's contagious. And when the first humans decided to ignore God's direction and do it my way instead of God's way, their sin and selfishness infected the perfect world that God created, and that infection has been passed down from generation to generation to us today. And much of the world's suffering is the direct result of human action. Not because God is punishing anybody, but because selfish people are acting selfishly. Instead of sharing their stuff and looking out for each other, people lie, cheat, steal, rob, kill, destroy, just like the enemy prompts them to do. And everybody suffers because of other people's bad behavior. When people are mistreated or abused or suffer need or neglect, God's not doing it. Most of the time, people are. But why doesn't God fix all of that? Why doesn't God just swat the enemy and wipe away all sin and selfishness and suffering and just get rid of it right now? Well, he's working on it. And he's already done the hard part. He came to earth as Jesus and died on the cross to set us free from sin. He rose again to offer us new life. He went back into heaven where he's praying for us right now, and he will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. And at that point, he's going to put an end to all selfishness and sin and suffering and pain. But if he were to do that today and show up to wipe out all sin, it would mean he would also wipe out all sinners. Now, we say that sounds pretty good, but that's only because we're already in the family. What if he'd come before we said yes to Jesus? Aren't we glad he didn't? And aren't we glad that God was patient enough to wait until we came into the family? And just as he waited patiently for us to turn to him, he's waiting patiently for all those others who are going to turn to him someday. Jesus will come again to wipe out sin and suffering and make everything right, but not until the right time, when everyone who wants to has said yes to Jesus and come into the family. God allows some of the suffering in the world because to wipe out all suffering, he'd have to wipe out everyone who causes that suffering, and he loves sinners too much to do that. Yet, aren't we glad he's patient? But that means we have to be patient too. Sometimes God allows suffering because he trusts us. In the struggle between good and evil, God puts us into the game because he has full confidence that, like Job, we can take some hits and endure some suffering if that's what it takes to win a victory over the enemy and expose him as the liar that he is. Now, I don't pay much attention to pro football because they play on Sunday, and I'm usually pretty busy on Sundays. But I do respect Tom Brady, the quarterback for the Super Bowl champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers, because for 20-plus years, he's been given his best to the game, which means he attracts lots of 300-pound monsters on the other side of the ball. And when he gets knocked down and sometimes knocked out, he doesn't complain or ask the coach, "Why is everybody always picking on me? Why does this hurt so much? Why is this so hard?" He knows that's just the price of playing on a championship team. When we get knocked down and sometimes knocked out by 300-pound problems, that's just the price of being on God's championship team. And I've read the end of the story in the last book of the Bible, Revelation. God's team wins. We will be the champions. Now, none of us are Tom Brady, but let's rejoice that God trusts us enough to dress us out and put us in the game against the enemy, even though that means that each of us is going to take some hits. When our game of life goes bad and it looks like we might lose our stuff or our family or our health, and we're tempted to get mad at God because we don't understand why, and we're hanging on by our fingernails, let's take a moment to remember that though life is hard, God never asks us to do anything that He hasn't already done. Isaiah said today about Jesus, "Surely He took up our pain and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on Him, and by His wounds we are healed." As hard as any of us may ever have it, none of us will ever have it that hard. And when we wonder why God allows suffering in the world, especially to someone who doesn't deserve it, like Job or Jesus or us, we just heard a hard truth from Hebrews. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, He offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save Him from death. And He was heard because of His reverent submission. Son though He was, however, He learned obedience from what He suffered. On the night before He died for us, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus cried out in anguish, "Father, if there's any other way, save me from the suffering to come." And God heard that prayer. And God answered that prayer and said, "Not yet." God answered and said, "I will save you, but only after the suffering." Because even though Jesus was the Son of God, He learned obedience and became all God intended Him to be only through that suffering. Sometimes that's how it works for us. God hears our cry for help and our and asking and begging for deliverance from suffering, and He will deliver us. Just sometimes not yet. Because it takes that suffering to hammer us and carve us into who God intends for us to become. And isn't that what we really want? To be all that God created us to be? Jesus' resurrection made the crucifixion worth the pain, and our resurrection will do the same for us. A bottom line sad reality is this: God does not cause our pain and suffering, but He does allow it. And sometimes He even gives the devil permission to do it. Now, most of the time, we won't know why. Sometimes it's because of other people's sin and selfishness. Sometimes it's because God trusts us enough to put us in the game to fight the devil and win. And sometimes it's because that suffering is what it takes to hammer us into the shape that God means for us to be as His sons and daughters to change the world with Jesus. No matter what the reason for our suffering, it hurts and it's hard. But the most important question about suffering is not, why is this happening to me? It's, what am I going to do about it? How do I respond? We have options. We can ignore our pain and hope it goes away, or we can pretend it doesn't exist, like that works. We can do our best to avoid pain, or when we hurt, we can self-medicate, which dulls the pain until we sober up. We can run away, although whenever we get to wherever we run to, we usually find our pain is right there waiting for us. We can grab a chokehold on life and try to control things and control people to keep the pain away, but sooner or later we realize that avoiding pain works about as well as ignoring it. Or we can just accept pain and suffering like Eeyore does. That's just the way life is. Oh, bother. Or we can rail against God and shake our fists and say, why are you doing this to me? What are you doing? And this is not fair. Which is what Job does in the middle of the story, as we're going to see next week. Spoiler alert, if you haven't read the whole story, it doesn't work. Being mad at God doesn't change anything. It doesn't make life any easier. And when we stomp away from God like angry children and slam the door of our heart, it doesn't hurt God. It hurts only us. And it puts a barrier between us and the God who loves us and has plans for us. Now, there are all kinds of unhelpful and unhealthy ways to deal with the inevitable pain and suffering of life. Most of us have probably tried most of them, and found out that they don't work for long. But Job and Jesus show us a way to deal with difficulty that works. And that is to look at Jesus as our example, as our high priest, and to do what he did with suffering. Embrace it. Embrace it. Embrace it and learn obedience through what we suffer. Look forward to eternity with God and each other when there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, as God promises us in Revelation. The hard truth of life and the hard truth of this story of Job is God doesn't cause our pain and suffering, but he does allow it. And sometimes he even gives the enemy permission to make it worse. And when we hurt, we may never know on this side of death why God allowed it. But Job and Jesus show us how to respond and how to deal with difficulty when it comes. By hanging on to God's promise that he is with us always, even to the end of the age. By trusting God to get us through whatever it is that the devil throws at us. And by looking ahead to that day when Jesus does come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and will fix all that's broken in the world and end all evil, all pain, and all suffering. Now, this concludes part 3 of our 4-week walk with Job. Please come back next Sunday and see how this story ends.